the comments or chat box where you're joining in from. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned with today's conversation. We suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And lastly, we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments in the chat with us. Now, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. Our guest for today is a cognitive neuroscientist who studies the neuroscience of creativity. She holds a degree in cognitive science from Johns Hopkins and Columbia University and earned her PhD in cognitive and brain sciences from Drexel University. Her research focuses on brain mechanisms and psychological conditions that underlie creativity, learning, and insight experiences. She's currently a postdoctoral research scientist at Feinstein Institute's Medical Research in New York and is the Director of Communications and Organizing Co-Chair for the Society of Neuroscience and Creativity. In addition to her academic work, she also began her career here at the Neuroleadership Institute. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Chesborough. Thanks for being here today, Christine.
So happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. And our moderator for today first coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more. A warm welcome to the co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. Thanks for being here today, David, and I will pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Shelby. And what a pleasure to get to be the interviewer instead of the interviewee for a change. And I'm so delighted to be joined by someone who knows, a whole lot more than I do about the neuroscience of insight and creativity. What a pleasure, Christine. This is such a wonderful thing. I remember. I'm going to tell the story in a moment. The very first time we met, it was nearly 10 years ago, probably.
Yeah, it was more than 10 years ago.
More than 10 years ago. How did you first come across NLI? Let's kind of start there.
Well, I was a senior in college and I was looking for what would be my first job. And I have actually this very, very specific memory of being in the library and perusing job postings on LinkedIn. And I came across NLI and I think you had a couple of job openings. And I tapped my friend next to me and I said, "Oh my God, look at this. This looks perfect. This looks incredible." And I reached out and the rest is history.
Actually, the story, the origin story is quite funny. I remember I was at a conference. We had a table and all this stuff, and I was speaking at a conference in downtown Manhattan. And you were applying for the EA roles. I remember, like an executive assistant, and must have been more than 10 years ago because my EA just celebrated 10 years, which means she has incredibly thick skin. So it was more than 10 years ago for sure. But I remember you were applying for the EA role, and I have this habit, people of, when I'm interviewing people, being really, really tough to see how they, think under pressure. And I remember asking, you came up to me and you were like, "Oh, I'm, applying for this role." I was like, I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to be a little mean and hard. I want to see how you think and how you process. And I asked you some hard question. I showed you a spreadsheet or something and asked you a really hard question, and you went 7 layers deeper than I'd even thought. I was like, "Oh crap, this person is not going to be my EA." You're just way, way smarter than anyone I'd met for a long time. And I'm like, "We got to hire you." And I think we actually hired you and didn't even know what job we were going to give you. We just said, "You should work here." And it took a little while to work it out. And I think you worked for us 5 or 6 years, and we were very small. I think we were 10 people or something in North America. I know you worked in sales for a while, and then in consulting, and then in research, and all sorts of roles. And then we were very sad one day when you said, "Well, I'm actually going to go off and study now and do my PhD." But now you finished, and now we're collaborating again on research and all sorts of stuff. So it's been a wonderful journey from that moment to now. You've got an amazing role in really in the whole science of insight and creativity now, involved in the Institute for that and doing really fantastic research. So congrats on your career. It's been delightful to collaborate for a while. So tell me, where, just kind of, that was the origin story. Where, tell me about your day job now. You briefly described it, but I think listeners would be fascinated. Describe your day job now, in help paint a picture for us.
Yeah. And it has been a very fun journey and quite a journey. So now, in my current job, I am a cognitive neuroscientist, and I work, although my research isn't clinical, I'm interested in just, I'm interested in all humans and sort of normal healthy functioning, as well as, things like brain disease. But I work in a hospital now because there's a particular group of people who come in for epilepsy monitoring. Actually, they have really bad epilepsy, and they are this very special group of neuroscience subjects because they come in and actually have electrodes implanted into their brains. And this is for clinical reasons. The research that we do with them is completely voluntary. They usually actually enjoy it because they're stuck in the hospital for a while, but usually you can't just implant electrodes into someone's brain who's healthy. Usually you have to study the brain from the outside using things like fMRI or go through the skull. And these folks are coming in, they hand in the hospital because their seizures need to be monitored. And while they're waiting, they're incredible research subjects because we're able to record brain signals literally directly from their brains. So the data that we get is really incredible. And it's a wild experience to get to work with these patients. And the lab that I'm in focuses on a lot of different questions in neuroscience, but what I'm working on is actually attention. So how can we tell when someone is sort of mind wandering off task? I mean, we have them do different things, watch movies, engage in sort of boring things, engage in interesting things. And then we just try to tell from their eye movements and from their EEG signals what their brain is doing. Are they paying attention now, or are they mind wandering? Did their brain go elsewhere? And mind wandering is a very healthy thing. We all do it. But we're trying to tell, just from the brain up, when does someone stop paying attention? When do they start mind wandering? And what does it look like in the brain when someone is mind wandering?
So you're doing really the foundational research on kind of the mechanics of mind wandering, like the timing, the networks involved, the experience,
Exactly.
and how that's really fascinating. I mean, mind wandering is sort of, if you had to describe the conditions most likely to increase insight in 2 words, you would use mind wandering. There's a lot more you can say. But I know, Jonathan Schooler has been talking about that for years. You worked with him, and many people would summarize the conditions that increase insight as mind wandering. So you're really like analyzing the territory of kind of the state that insight occurs in. That's fascinating. What are some of the findings so far? Is probably too early to say a lot, but what are you seeing so far?
Yeah. So we're really looking for, we want to understand what mind wandering looks like in the brain, but the holy grail is to be able to detect what happens when we make that switch, when we go from paying attention externally to then sort of going within ourselves and our minds going off, and what is happening in our brains isn't what's going on in the external world. So we're looking for the sort of neural signature or sort of fingerprint of what that switch looks like. So the switch from external to internal attention
Right.
and vice versa. And our brains do this all the time. And it's a healthy thing. It can be an unhealthy thing. So there's lots of implications for what we can do with that information. But right now, what it looks like is, if you're paying attention, to what's going on around you, all of the parts of the brain that are processing sensory information like vision and hearing are all very active because you're taking in all that information, you're processing it. As soon as you start mind wandering, those regions kind of go dark, and a network called the default mode network starts becoming very active. So there's probably more to it than that, but that's what sort of the overall big picture looks like, and we're digging deeper into it.
It's fascinating. I mean, I wrote a piece called "The Neuroscience of Mindfulness" years and years ago. That was really the sort of the center chapter of my last book, Your Brain at Work, and it described a study that I just got obsessed by, the FARB study that I'm sure you know inside out. A big team of people did this work to posit that there were these 2 basic conditions when you're paying attention. And essentially, it's kind of you're paying attention to real-time stimuli in the moment. Mostly that's external, but it can be internal. And so that's like, sight, sound, taste, smell, all the senses. And when that network is up, the other network is down, a bit of a seesaw, and that other network is, they call it the narrative network. So we call it the direct experience versus narrative network. And the narrative network is mind wandering. The narrative network is basically memories and fears and thoughts and concepts. So it's more of a prefrontal network for sort of concepts and goals and strategies and anxiety and all that stuff. So it's very limbic. And so those two are in a seesaw. So it sounds like you're actually looking at like those two networks. That's the way I hear it. You're looking at sort of what happens when those two networks shift. Is that somewhat correct?
Yeah, exactly. And you can call it the narrative network. There's other names for it. A lot of neuroscientists call it the default mode network. And it's really sort of what is your brain doing when you're not focused on what's going around you. And if you're thinking about, if you're internal and your mind is going elsewhere, you're usually thinking about yourself and others, or sort of engaging in associative thought. And that is a very productive state, or it can be a very productive state for creativity. It can also be involved in clinical disorders. Like too much mind wandering is not necessarily a good thing, but the right amount of mind wandering can be really, really helpful, and it can make you so much more productive than always trying to be in a very focused state of attention.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so,
we talk about that in relation. We talk about that in relation to the healthy mind platter, that we're very anchored on focus time, which is like goal focus, right? Or we have, physical time, which is really healthy for the brain. Social time is really healthy for the brain. Novelty is healthy for the brain. But healthy for the brain also is downtime, where you're not goal focused at all. And that's mind wandering. That's when mind wandering can happen, when you're not, focused on goals. So if you shut out all your downtime, you're going to have less mind wandering. So it's interesting. I think a bunch of folks on the line are probably thinking to themselves, can we make sure you don't sell this data to Elon Musk so he can't like program this stuff he's building to know when we're not paying attention? Just let's make sure we don't do that. But with that aside, let me do a sort of 2-minute summary through the research that we've done on Insight, and you were involved in some of this. But I just think for folks who haven't heard, I think it'd be really interesting. And we actually ran one of these sessions just in the last month or two, specifically on the 3 bodies of research we did on Insight. So maybe my team can put that in the chat. Folks can download it later. But we published 3 papers on Insight. The first one was in 2008, which tells you how old I am. That paper was really inspired by Mark Beeman's work and some others who were looking at essentially the neural conditions for insight to occur. And that paper was specifically about like, how do you kind of have more insights? Like what are the necessary conditions for insight? And so we looked at sort of understanding the neural conditions. And the cliff note, first of all, the sort of punchline is that insights involve quiet signals deep in the brain. And anything that helps you be able to notice quiet signals increases the likelihood of insights coming through, which is a different theory. It's like insights are always there and you don't notice them because your brain's noisy. Make your brain quieter, insights can come through. So it's a really different hypothesis. And then we dug into what those conditions would be, and we developed a hypothesis around 4 conditions that continues to this day to be really helpful. But all of them correlate to being able to notice quiet signals and have them come through. And it's a sort of essentially like quiet, so not a lot of activation of the brain, not a lot of emails, right? Not a lot of talking. Internally focused, so you're actually not processing data. Slightly positive, because slightly negative is the option, and that's noisier. And then not actively problem solving the way you have so far. So letting your brain kind of take different paths. So anyway, that was that first paper. And we published a big piece in HBR called How to Have More Insights. We published in a bunch of places about the aha moment, and a lot of that went into further research. Anyway, that was the first paper. The second paper you were involved in, which was essentially a paper on kind of why insight is so important, and like why we call it why insight matters. And it turns out that like when you learn things with insight, you remember it much, much longer. You generalize the insight to many domains, right? So when you have an insight like, oh, I should prioritize myself, you prioritize yourself in many domains, as an example, right? So insights, get generalized. They're memorable, they change behavior, and they motivate. And we actually did one study of people showing a really strong connection between strength of insight and likelihood of action. So it's central to learning to read, it's central to creativity, it's central to innovation, it's central to leadership development, coaching, learning, sort of everything. So that was that second paper. And then the third paper was something that I'd been thinking about for a decade before we published, which was, can we create a measure for the strength of the insight? And that's the Eureka scale. So we wrote a paper, we finally got that paper out, defining the different steps of the Eureka scale, the measures, how we measure it, what it is. And it's a super powerful framework to have a 5-point scale measuring the strength of insight. And I'd been thinking about that way back, from when I first started talking to Mark Beeman, like, why is there no measure for how strong an insight is if it's so important? Why is there no measure? So there is one now. So anyway, that's the research that we did. Anything you want to add to that? Just, and then we'll dig into kind of what you've been studying since and what we're seeing in the literature now.
No, I mean, I think that the way that you have conceptualized insight is driven by science. You've been talking to scientists for 20, 25 years now about insight. And so many of the hypotheses that you had and sort of the way you think about insight, turns out not only to be true, but supported by data now, and data that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago even. So I just want to acknowledge how sophisticated your thinking has always been about insight. And really everyone is just catching up to where you've been. So there's lots that's been done. Insight, we know so much more about it now than we did. And part of that is because the entire field of the neuroscience of creativity has grown immensely over the last 20 years. Really, some of the papers that Mark Beeman and John Kunios and Jonathan Schooler wrote in the early 2000s, they were sort of the beginning. And now it's a huge field of hundreds of researchers and studying insight, studying lots of other things related to creativity, and it's an exciting time. So there's lots that we know now, but you, I think, have always been on the right track.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you. As an Australian, I want to deny all of that and say it's not true. It's not true. But thank you. That's kind. I mean, I was following a lot of observation and really, and I was talking to the scientists at the time. I was like debating and digging in. It didn't just come from nowhere. I would never have got these theories without a lot of time with Mark Beeman and others. And I would just literally fly out and meet them and spend a few days like explain this, and really try to develop a proper theory. I mean, the scarf model took 3.5 years of that before I published. So I was always really keen to, not just make something up, actually synthesize accurately what the science is. In fact, one paper we published, we actually retracted 6 months after we published it because even though we'd done the work, it wasn't on insight, another domain, but we'd done the work, it just wasn't like 100%. So I've always been super passionate about accurate synthesis of the space. Anyway, enough about me. Tell me, just give us a little more of the shape. Like what you just said is really interesting, I'm sure, to people. Give us a little more of the shape of kind of the field over 20 years. And I think you're involved in the industry group now as well. And tell us a little bit more about the shape. Is there an annual conference? What are they publishing? What kind of things are they studying? And then maybe let's talk about creativity and insight.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the cognitive neuroscience is sort of nascent as of 30 or 40 years ago, which in the lifespan of sciences is pretty young, and the neuroscience of creativity is even younger than that because creativity is really complex. It's easier to study things like perception and colors and studying sort of what goes on when we have complicated ideas is one of the hardest things to do in neuroscience. So it has taken a lot of sort of incremental steps and progress over time to get to a point where we can really study creativity on a neuroscience level. And that time is really now. It's a super exciting time to be in the field. And insight was one of the first things studied in the neuroscience of creativity because it's such a discrete moment and it's always been associated with creativity. And it's a moment that happens in time. You can pinpoint it, and so if you can pinpoint it in time, then you can study it with neuroimaging. So that's why some of the very first studies in the neuroscience of creativity were trying to understand aha moments, and from there it's really flourished. And so there's a lot of work on insight. there's also a lot of work on things like divergent thinking, sort of the process of generating ideas, whether those ideas are, come via insight or not. There's a lot of research on things like attention and motivation and mind wandering, and creativity really involves the whole brain, which is why I love studying, and you don't need to choose. And things like, what are the dynamics that sort of give rise to creativity? What are the characteristics of different types of people who seem to be more creative than others, or at least be able to come up with novel ideas more spontaneously, or sort of higher quality ideas? And what does that look like on short time scales and long time scales? And
All right, let's pause there. I'm going to speak for everyone here and say, tell us more about the individual difference. What have we learned in the last 20 years about individual difference? Because it does seem like there are people who just seem to come up with a ton of ideas, and there's plenty of bad ones in there. But myself being one, I seem to come up with a lot of ideas, including a lot of bad ones.
You have to come up with a lot of bad ideas to have a few good ones, and that's actually one of the things, right? People who end up having the most creative ideas generate more ideas, and a lot of them aren't good, but you're sort of, you're increasing the likelihood that one is going to be good.
Reminds me of a meme I saw on a reel somewhere. I'm not on TikTok, but it popped up somewhere, and about, like, I think it was comparing the big name musicians and what percentage of their songs are actually hits. That, like, you think, oh my God, Taylor Swift's amazing, she got so many hits, but you see that it's only like 10, 20, 30% of their songs are actually go anywhere, and there's a bunch of them go nowhere. It's like, and you miss that stuff in life. So I think being able to just generate a lot of ideas must be central to creativity. What else have we learned about individual difference in creativity and insight?
Yeah. So, and it sort of piggybacking off of that point, if you're going to sort of put yourself out there and have just as many bad ideas as good ideas, there's a sort of bravery involved in that. There's a sort of tolerance for risk. Creativity it can be scary. It's also hard. So you have to be really motivated to engage in creative activity. It's much more difficult. It usually takes longer, and it is more frustrating to choose to come up with something that hasn't been done before, instead of sticking with an option that you might know works. So what are the personality characteristics of people who choose the latter instead of the former? It's people who are really curious, who are reward motivated, and so that sort of translates to sometimes being comfortable with risk, and particularly reward motivated around sort of the rewards of understanding things. It feels good to understand things. It feels good to figure things out. And that's just a human thing. We all enjoy puzzles and sort of learning new things, but people who are really successfully creative really appreciate that and seek it out and prioritize it over other things, including oftentimes money and comfort.
They love problem solving. They just like, and their brain almost gets itchy if they're not problem solving.
Exactly. You'll make a problem if one doesn't exist.
Yeah. I sometimes I joke, if I take like a serious vacation, I've got to be careful I don't, like write a play or something. My brain just keeps going on something, right? If I try to, so it's best to just, have good, healthy problems to solve at all times if you've got a brain that kind of likes to do that, I guess. That's really interesting. So there's different reward mechanisms involved, different sort of prioritizing of problem solving. But how big is the individual variation? How big is that individual variation in creative output?
Yeah, I mean, creativity is like every other, human characteristic, and it's a continuum, right? And there's going to be one really far end of the bell curve in one direction, and then most people are going to be in the middle. And, I also came to this sort of, and still do really believe that, the way that we've talked about creativity historically, this is a bit of a caveat, is, we talk about these amazing creative artists, and the people who sort of break through are the ones who are successful. And that leads people to sort of conceptualize creativity as this thing that only some people, some really incredible and sort of the 1% of creative artists are able to achieve. That's just not true. Creativity is a human thing. And that's actually one of the things that separates us from other animals. And so everyone is creative. Everyone can be more creative, and sort of so much of creativity is also nurture instead of nature. And so there's room for, I think, lift across the board. That being said, I have run experiments and actually just been flabbergasted at some people. They just like ooze creativity, and it's coming out of their pores. And you can, on one hand, I really believe in this sort of democratic view of creativity and want to encourage creativity and talk about it as a really accessible thing that people can see themselves as engaging in. And then it's just also true that there are people who are really creative, and it's usually people who sort of have these sorts of characteristics.
It's an interesting dilemma. It's an interesting dilemma because you don't want to like say, well, there's massive variation in creativity and accidentally create a fixed mindset around creativity, right? Where people go, well, I'm not that creative. I'm not one of those top people. So got to be careful. I think it's a delicate dance. There does seem to be strong individual variation, but all people have it and all people can improve it. And it's a learnable skill, but there are people who might have just higher starting point than others. One of my close friends is one of the founders of the Blue Man Group. Highly creative people, highly creative guy. He's just fun to do anything with. Just to go out for dinner with. Some creative craziness just happens in the simplest things. So there are people who just live in a world of constant creativity, and there are people where it's not as primed as sort of the first. And I think it's partially that priming from sort of nurture that they've sort of made it, their habit, but there's some basis. So we have to be careful of a fixed mindset. Let's go back a step. You sort of said it, but I just want to crystallize it a bit more. The relationship between creativity and insight, like for the layperson, how would you explain that so people could take this to the bank? Give me the sort of crisp definition on that.
Yeah, so the way that we think about the relationship between creativity and insight now is that insight is part of creativity. It is not all of creativity. And I say that being extremely fascinated by insight, and I think it's the coolest thing ever, but it is just one part of the creative process. It's a really important part of the creative process. In order to have an insight, especially a creative insight, you really have had to work at something for a long time, and you have had to be motivated at something for a long time. And so there's this long lead up. And then there's, what happens, you might have an amazing insight, and then that just gives you more work to do, right? Because now you resolve some impasse, you have clarity, you get it, right? And so it's sort of the beginning and the end. And I see insights as sort of punctuating the creative process. It can sort of be the moment of inspiration for something, and then you set out on some process of actually building a thing, generating a thing, exploring some new idea or way of doing something, and actually being successful at that requires just a ton of focus and grunt work and sustained motivation that and especially really big insights, they're going to feed you for a while, but you're going to have to find motivation elsewhere in the meantime. And then sort of you come to a problem, and if you have done all your homework and set up, you're going to have more insights. And so I see it as creativity as a sort of roller coaster, and insights are like turbo, engines that can be sort of activated at different times to get you to the finish line. So I think that they're, maybe 30, 50 years ago, I think because insights are so salient, we all have them, and they've always been associated with these big moments of creativity. Now talking about it not as that is what creativity is or the end point, but as part of the process that is important because it's a means to an end motivationally, and in terms of your clarity, and in terms of sort of giving you the push to get from point A to point B.
Right. I think sometimes I think of it as like the active ingredient, like in a drug, you've got an active ingredient, right? But you still need filler, and you might need, a pill, you might need coating, you might need things that make it digest, but you have to have that active ingredient. So it's required, not sufficient for creativity, but maybe it's not even required for all types of creativity, but for certain types of creativity, it's maybe not required, but it's extremely helpful, but not just on its own as well. I'm a bit of a Japanophile, I'll admit. I love the culture there, the creativity, the novelty of, those of you who haven't been there, it's like a different version of humanity split off 300 years ago, and just they do everything differently. And whereas the whole of the Western world, and then Japan kind of just does everything differently. It's so fascinating seeing the divergence of sort of human habits in some ways. And one of the things that was fascinating was working with Honda. I think, did you work with Honda with us? Were you on that project? Maybe you were.
I worked on Honda a bit after I worked for NLI actually, and so I know what you're talking about. The Japanese corporate culture is incredible,
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah, so we worked with Honda. They had 25,000 scientists working on like research. So we worked with the research function, with the leadership there, and helping them think about like insight, innovation, creativity, how to create more of a growth mindset across 25,000 scientists. So it was fascinating. We went back and forth over quite a few years, and but one of the things that really struck me was well, two things. One thing was their robot, which they've kind of got out of the robot business now, but they spent probably billions building the most advanced, incredible robots, and just watching it like literally dance in front of you was terrifying. But suddenly we're back to Elon Musk again. But the thing that really blew me away was the whole origin story of Honda. It was basically a guy who saw women riding bicycles, carrying a lot of shopping back home and struggling with it. And he thought, oh, I'm going to add an engine. There was this whole like all these engines lying around from the wars in like 1940s. There's all these like decommissioned engines lying around and little engines. He's like, oh, I'm going to try putting an engine on a bike and see if I can help people get home easier with big loads of shopping. And I think it was his wife, maybe, I don't remember exact that part, I'm not sure about, but this was the sort of story. And then he started doing that and then really quickly accelerated. But there was just this basic concept of taking one idea and adding it to another. Let's take an engine and put it on a bike, right, to solve a problem. And to me, that's what insight is. Insight is just basically connecting things that haven't been connected before. And in the moment when they're connected, it releases energy, depending on sort of how long you've been working on the problem for and the implications of the solution and all this stuff. But it has this intrinsic motivation. It's very similar to a really, really, really funny joke. But even more so because it can have these aftershocks for, in this case, lifetimes. But it's such a powerful moment when you put things together that haven't been put together before, sort of in the brain and all that, and kind of releases energy. Has there been much study on that, like the sort of Eureka scale concept? What have you seen out there on sort of measuring insight and the impact of them?
Yeah, definitely. So, there's been a change actually in the way that insight is studied in the lab that, and there's been sort of different phases of insight research, as there are, in all domains. But it used to be studied more as like you either have one or you don't, or depending on the kind of problem. So certain problems were considered, insight problems. Then people were interested in, differences between arriving at a problem by insight or through a more analytical approach. So just, this binary choice, aha moment or not aha moment. And now in the past 10 years or so, scientists have introduced scales to that. So not just did you have an insight, but how strong was it? And also the sort of subcomponents of insight that sort of make up that aha experience metacognitively. There's the rewarding component of it, certainty, the sort of suddenness with which you came to the idea. So sort of picking that apart and, that those pieces sort of correspond to different cognitive functions. The suddenness is about attention. The rewarding part is about sort of the reward mechanisms of the brain, and confidence is a sort of can be a downstream effect of reward, but and also sort of, how much did you know about this problem before you approached it? And how does that increase the likelihood of you having an insight? How does it increase those factors? So that's a bit of a nerdy answer, but
Right.
The sort of trying to understand the intensity of this emotional experience is very important to understanding what it even is and what it's made of.
Right. Insight. Yeah. Interesting. So I put it in the chat earlier, but I'll put it back in the sort of public version of the Eureka scale we published in Fast Company. And the Eureka scale paper, when we published it, took into account all those amazing studies, and we reference a lot of them, kind of explaining it. And so the Eureka scale is like a sort of you can certainly use it in the lab, but it's also something you can use like day to day to just like understand the importance of an idea. Like you have an insight, like, oh, okay, is it a 3? Is it a 4? Is it a 5? One of my favorite things to do after an event, like our 2-day summit is coming up this October. We'll ask this at the end of each day. How many people had a level 5 insight, right? And a level 5 insight on a 5-point scale is one that you'll probably remember your whole life, and you'll reorganize many things in the real world around it. And you'll be able to remember it certainly in decades, like that moment when something changed, right? You picked your career, or you changed your whole life or something. So those are level 5s. Those are big, and I'm amazed actually at how many level 5s we get in a really well-designed experience. But a level 4, you've obviously got 4.1, 4.2. A 4 is the entry point for getting real motivation happening. So when people have a 4, they seem to be motivated enough that they're very likely to take action on some level. And so that's your sort of entry point if you're designing, a leadership program or a learning program of any sort, or a change initiative or a leadership retreat or whatever. You want pretty much like 3/4 of the group at least to have at least one level 4 insight, or it's really failing. You really want 100% of people to have at least one level 4 insight, because they're going to do things differently as a result. And the people who say, oh yeah, I'm not really going to do much differently out of this experience, they haven't had a level 4 insight. They've probably had a level 3 where things are like interesting. There's some implications, but not a lot of motivation. And then so that's sort of how we've been framing it. How would you sort of link that back to the research you're seeing out there?
Yeah. So a few things. One is, I would say that the in these kinds of learning experiences that you're running, you're getting people at such a perfect moment for them to have insights. They're interested, they're coming in curious, and they probably have some problem that they're trying to solve. Either if it's related to their own sort of skills and ability to do things, or there's things in their work or their life that they're trying to work on. And, they've done all of that background work, right? And so when you are able to provide explanations and sort of ways of seeing things that tie so much of what they've noticed together into a really sort of coherent picture, you're sort of collapsing all of this uncertainty and all of this sort of disorganized knowledge that people develop sort of over time in their careers into sort of a clear explanation. That is just the perfect moment pedagogically, or if you're designing learning, that's how you would do it. That's how you would want to do the work to get someone in that space, and then think about how to bring it all together. So if you're designing for insight, you're not going to introduce A, B, C, D. You might jump around a bit and then bring it all together so that you can create those powerful moments. So there's actually been some cool research on that in the education space over the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking with Ben Gelb recently. So we ran into each other socially, and I'd seen him perform a few times. He's a comedian, very successful comedian, and I loved his performances. They're very impromptu, like working with the audience in real time. You can really see how funny someone is when they're not prepared, right? He was just hilariously funny, and I really loved talking to him. And I was asking him about sort of the state of comedy now. We're having this whole intellectual debate because I'd been telling him about some of this science over dinner, and I was explaining what Mark Beeman said to me probably 15 years ago. He said, the best comedians sort of create like a gap and then close that gap, right? And it's funny, and then but then that's part of a bigger story. Then they close that gap, and then sort of the whole comedy set completes with some big insight that sort of brings it all together. And those are the most rewarding, comedy sets, and also the most rewarding books and movies and all this other stuff, right? Got insights within insights within insights. And Ben was lamenting the state of comedy today, where they've sort of given up that art a bit, and they're just shooting things at people, and it's sort of like scattergun approach of funny things without any overarching themes, or they sort of moved away from that stylistically in comedy now. And I was like, oh, that's really a shame. And
is that because sort of I imagine it's at least partially driven by sort of movements to shorter formats online. So are you basically designing jokes so that they can be captured in the length of a TikTok video versus spending 20 minutes on a set that has a really huge payoff that people online wouldn't get if you're only able to clip 60 seconds of it?
Absolutely. I have no idea how we got onto that topic, but it jumped into my brain.
It's a good transition. On that note, I would, bring up the sort of the importance of attention and insight. And we do think about, diffuse attention and sort of being in a mind wandering state or being relaxed as the state in which insights can happen. But in order, you're not going to have an insight if you don't have the raw material to connect in those moments. And part of what we lose when we are, when our attention is sort of not able to focus on things deeply enough to sort of build up that raw material, is the ability to sort of create patterns through reflection after. So if we're sort of always on, and if our attention scattered and the quality of learning is just worse, we're not in the right headspace to have insight, but we also haven't done the lead up work to even have one if we were in the right headspace.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to address a comment or two in the chat with sort of an observation that I've seen. And then I think let's switch gears and think about the implications of all this for innovation at work and creativity at work and all that. But, we've trained a lot of facilitators at NLI over the years. We have a lot of faculty who go out and deliver our work. And the goal of our work when we're delivering something, we don't do that much in person anymore. It's, well before the pandemic, it shifted to virtual. But in that case, even more importantly, the goal is to generate insights, right? So we're not delivering content. We're trying to facilitate the strongest possible insight. And so I've always explained to facilitators that there's sort of three levels at which your attention can be pointed. Three directions your attention can go as the facilitator of a learning experience. Most people, when they're starting out with a new product or just starting in the field, their attention's on themselves or the content, right? They're like trying to remember the content, trying to remember where they are, or they're very self-focused, a little bit self-conscious, overly self-conscious. And other people read that as uncomfortable. It makes them uncomfortable. And other people can see that you're not fully with them, that you're with internal ideas. And it just makes people check out because they don't feel connected to you. It's not a good state, right? The second state that people go is they try to make sure that everyone in the room is getting the content, whether that's a virtual room or physical room. But what happens is you end up teaching to the lowest common denominator. Whoever's the slowest person to get this sort of dominates the conversation. You're trying to make sure everyone really understands this. It's ironically not the healthiest way to create the strongest insights. The healthiest way to create the strongest insights is you try to help people have insights, and then you try to connect them together in different ways. And so you try to find those meta insights that connect the insights together. And so you have people popping, and then you get those people to share their insights, which helps everyone pop as well. Because insights seem to help other people have insights. And so you're essentially giving attention to insight, not giving attention to people not getting it. You're giving attention to insight, connecting them together, and then trying to create those meta insights, like Mark Beeman told me was so useful, years ago. So that's how I think the best facilitators actually create the most change, is they literally give attention to maximize and deepen insight in that way, which is a really interesting implication. So.
Yeah, to be in conversation with someone, whether it's two people talking or the facilitator, creating an environment where it feels conversational and that that their attention is on you, should really help. And I saw a paper published just in the last year, and I can't believe that this hadn't been done previously. Studying instead in the lab usually happens, one person in one room or at their computer or something, having insights based on some prompt, but someone studied people having insights in conversation. And of course, insights happen in conversation. It just needed someone to sort of do the work to study it. And they found some interesting personality and gender differences too, which aren't prescriptive, but women report having lots of insights when they're talking to people. And not that men don't, but women just do more. And I think that sort of reveals, one of the other mechanisms of insight that we don't talk about as much, but obviously is implicit in all of your work, is the insight through conversation. And especially if you have a friend or a collaborator where you know enough of the same things, that you're speaking the same language, but you're bringing different things and perspectives to the picture, and you can really sort of open up new trains of thought and help one another see things differently. So if you have a friend that you always seem to sort of have jokes or insights with, that's no accident. And the best teams are made up of people. I think you have that kind of
super fun. So so many different things coming up for me, but I just want to get this out of my queue, which is a brain speak. But we decided just in the last few months to actually kind of give away some of our best training and thinking that we normally reserve for our own facilitators, and we're actually opening up a program called Brain-Based Design and Facilitation. And one of the features of that will actually be teaching faculty how to generate insights, both from a design perspective and facilitation perspective. So it's brain-based design and facilitation. You could call it insight-based design and facilitation, or whatever, because that'll be such a centerpiece. Although real change, insight's a piece of it. You also want a few other things that are really, really important. So that we're running that in New York in person. We're doing one in London in person, and then we're going to run a virtual one early in the new year. And if you're interested in sort of getting info about that, just put I guess it's a complex metaphor name. We need a better name for it. BBDF, brain-based design facility. Put BBDF in the chat and your company name, and someone will get back to you with details of that and the virtual program. You'll be able to get into that. So that's something that's coming up. But I think there's a lot of, like, when you understand insight, there's a lot of things that you'll do differently, in designing and facilitating. The one thing I'll say about the data in conversation, I wish we'd really collected data formally, but I used to run all our brain-based coaching programs for the first decade or so, and I designed an exercise that collected data, but we never formally collected it. But I was observing this, and I would have observed this north of probably north of 1,000 people over more than 50 different programs over a decade. And what I saw was we collected data about basically, everyone write down a challenge that you wish you had an insight about, like something you're really stuck on for weeks or months or years. Everyone write down a challenge. We call it an impasse. Pair up randomly, talk for 10 minutes, see what happens. No explanation, no training, starting point. And what we found is about 5% of the time, when you just sit down and have a conversation about an impasse, an insight happens. And we would define that insight as something changed, and there's a very high likelihood you're going to do something differently now. So as I'd call it, a level 4 insight, not just a 3, right? So we didn't have that language then. But about 5% of the time, 1 in 20 conversations, if you pair 20 people up, which means you got 40 because you got pairs, right? You're pairing 40 people up into 20 pairs. A good, one person from that group will say, wow, something really big happened, and I've just not had that insight before, and I really am going to do something differently. So that was really interesting. And then we measured this with people who'd done normal coach training or therapy or counseling and other stuff, and we had an opportunity to measure this, and we found that was 30 to 50%. In populations that had some training in just more solutions focused questions, or they just had some some basic training. But we found when we taught the specific conditions that increase insight, which I been talking about, when we actually taught that, and we taught a questioning approach that focused on insight, we got that to 75%. And I've been talking about my team about reproducing this and collecting data again formally with a study, but we were able to get that to 75%. And sometimes in the workshops, it would be 100%, which was super spooky, because this is a 10-minute conversation and something that they'd had for months or years. And just by having the right dialogue, you know, could bring them to insight. So I'm going to terrify you all by saying that we've trained AI on how to do this now. And we have an AI that has this exact approach to coaching built in now. And we're beta testing this with some partners. It's called Niles, if you haven't been following us, a neuro intelligent leadership enhancing system. So Niles can actually coach you through any impasse and really help you have an insight. It's quite terrifying and amazing. So it's yeah, that's a lot of fun. Anyway, Christine, back to you.
I'm gonna challenge us to take really seriously measuring this in the future, because I think that data is absolutely invaluable, and the data that you already have is incredible, and everyone, you know, the proof is in the outcomes. But I think that we can capture that data, and I think that we can come up with good ways to also measure what happens after a month, 3 months, 6 months later.
Yeah. I think we could do it virtually now, like pair people up for, you know, get people registered for a study and actually just do it virtually. Like, oh, you've got, you know, people just popping up in a room. So we're going to design and get onto that. But it's just amazing that you could get people to have insights just by, you know, focusing questions on the mechanics of insight. And you could show me, you know, someone says, I'm having trouble with a project. You could show me 100 questions and I can stack rank them as to which ones are most likely to generate insight. Like the science is actually really well developed now. But let's shift gears. Your thoughts on innovation in companies, your thoughts on you know, the implications of all this for organizations, innovations, and creativity. What are your reflections on that?
Yeah, there's you know, there's a really growing interest, I think, in applying the science of creativity to organizational contexts. And there's quite a bit of research, but less than you might think, actually, because it's a really tough challenge, right? You have you're balancing the demands of just getting stuff done and enabling people to sort of fulfill, you know, basic, the basic functions of their job in a world that is constantly changing. And then creativity is often kind of seen as a nice to have after that. I think the changing perspective would be, actually, the kind of work that we do now requires creativity all the time, even if you don't have sort of a creative job. You know, there's careers or sort of roles that are categorized as like, oh, this is a creative role, this is a non-creative role, like the graphic designers, the research scientists who are in R&D, you know, the artists, the animators, right? Those are the you know, the creatives, or the screenwriters, and then there's everyone else. And I think that there probably are different processes, similar to the way that we think about high performers, or you know, picking out high potential individuals, which of course is, you know, the best practices are sort of always in flux on that. But there may be different things that you might do for people who are, you know, those oozing creativity people, because those people
Right.
can be more difficult to manage sometimes, because, you
Yeah.
know, if you are, you know, I think people have one of the sort of, I guess, big aha moments or funniest things that I feel like I've learned through this process is, you know, people who are super creative are not always the easiest to work with. They can be really great, but also really difficult. You know, if you think that your creative idea is good enough, you might be kind of, you know, really focused on yourself, or bullish in how you approach things. Yeah. And those are really good things in context, but sort of, you know, how do you sort of enable the best from super creative people? And that, you know, not all super creative people are like that, but there's a lot that comes with the territory of being in that category. And it would be, you know, not only noticing that, identifying those as strengths rather than problems to fix, and, you know, having different processes or different ways of managing people who have a lot of creative potential is one way. But then I also think that there's solutions for everyone, right? How do we see the opportunities for creativity in all of our work? And it's not that we're trying to make our work more creative, but just notice when different problems actually require a creative approach and label it, so that we can sort of lift everyone's boats as well.
Yeah, we apply, those are really deep thoughts. Thank you. We apply some of that at NLI. You know, we do almost all our meetings are virtual. And, you know, we'll often just pause and say, we're at a point we need some insight. let's all just walk away from our computers, leave everything on, go and make a cup of tea, come back in 5 minutes, or let's just leave this, come back to it tomorrow. So we're often noticing when something is at an impasse and that we need like a divergent answer. And we'll let that, really let that sit. Speaking of divergent answers, as we wrap this up, I'm going to hand back to Shelby in a moment, but I know you're speaking at the summit coming up. I'll put that link in the chat. The summit this year is fully virtual, but the upside of that is you can like bring your whole team along and participate from anywhere. And we've got an amazing program coming up. You're involved in one of the sessions on the keynote, I think on day 2, around AI and creativity in the brain. And we're going to be digging into how to leverage the strengths of AI and the strengths of the human brain to really increase creativity, and building on some of this. So thanks for participating in that. It's going to be a great summit. We're psyched about the program and the people involved. Christine, just such a pleasure to connect again, and congrats on your contributions in the field. I look forward to a lot more collaboration as we go further in studies, and I think we probably should run a Neuroscience of Insight and Creativity conference together at some point. And thanks again. Yeah, thanks again for joining us. Any closing comments before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I can't thank you enough. I've learned so much from you, and I'm so excited to be able to continue learning from you. And there's so much opportunity in this space, and I'm really excited to be able to work in a slightly different capacity than before. But everyone should be excited about the opportunities for creativity at work, and it's going to be really fun.
I think there's so much more research to do. It's still very, very early days, and some incredible things. And yeah, I'm psyched to be collaborating again. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks everyone for being here. Back to you, Shelby, and take care of yourselves. Look after each other. Keep doing what matters. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christine and David, for today's discussion. We appreciate your time and always look forward to hearing new insights. As we shared, the poll is up. Let us know how NLI can help you in the future. As I already mentioned, Summit 2024 is on the way. It will take place October 29th and 30th, and you won't want to miss it. It will be a virtual experience. So if you want any information to know more about our speakers, sessions that are happening, and be in the know, visit summit.neuroleadership.com for all your needs. Also, if you enjoyed today's session, we have our podcast, Your Brain at Work. So wherever you listen to your podcast, you can search for that and episodes will be there. And this is where we say farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes, thank you so much for being here every week, and we will see you back next Friday. Have a wonderful day.